Hello, my name is Pranav Kothari. I work at Educational Initiatives. EI's mission is to see a world where every child is learning with understanding. Today's episode of EI Dialogues is with Meeta Sengupta. Meeta has worked for over 20 years in education across different slices of it. This includes research, it includes teacher training, talking with the government on various policy issues, as well as writing. She's essentially very active on Twitter, as well as a regular column in ways that allow her writing to be translated to impact on the ground. In this conversation, we talk about policy. How is it made? Who are these policy makers? What is the role of public-private partnership in the education sector? How is research done? And what assessments and the nature of questions should be asked in the education system? Thank you so much for coming to the show, Meeta. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here, and as I say, teachers first.
Thank you. So, Meeta, how has education policy evolved in India over the years?
Actually, one thing that India has done very, very well has been education policy. We have these beautifully crafted, beautifully phrased, very ambitious and yet grounded policy statements. And you'll read the policy statements, you read the policy documents, 1968, 1986, all of them, and you feel elevated. And that is the purpose of policy, to raise the game. There is a little distinction between policy and practical reality. And every practitioner who reads the policy will probably look at it from a practitioner's point of view. They'll look at it and say, this is all ambition. Well, yes, that's the point out there, that this is the ambition. This is about the next step forward, going forward, and a few guidelines. So a policy is meant to be a guideline. It doesn't give you a set of rules. So it'll give you a guideline on saying, this is how we want our village schools to be arranged. This is how we want our pedagogy to evolve. This is how we want our assessment systems to evolve. And at a higher level, we will say, this is how we want our teachers to practice. Now, when you say teachers to practice, what you're actually saying is, in the classroom, this is what must happen. And now we come to, and that's the dark side of the moon here. Because when you look at that and you look at the policy and you ask, how does this translate to what happens in the classroom? There's a blank there. The bridge between policy and practice is what we have not built.
And why is that?
Well, I actually asked a set of policymakers that question because one of the things that I believe is that the construction of policy, when you set out to design a policy, whether it is the RTE Act, which was a massive policy initiative, is to test it out using various scenarios, saying here are 10 or 15 possible scenarios, and this is how the policy will play out in these scenarios. And I asked a set of policymakers, why don't you do that? And I was summarily dismissed with, that's not our job. It's true, they are right. It's not their job to test out the scenario, but then this is my question, whose job is it?
So who are these policymakers? I mean, can you tell us how is policy made in the first place? Who makes it? What's the process followed?
Across the world or in India?
In India.
In India. In India, especially in education, I'm going to be a little bit provocative and say that policy making has now become a bit of a monopolistic, or almost, let's say, I wouldn't call it a cartel because we like to fight amongst ourselves as well and argue amongst ourselves. But there is an us element of it where we say, here are the experts and here are the establishmentarians, and we will sit together in committees and we will figure out what the policies are. This was the provocative bit. Policies are effectively decided by the government. For example, the president is the chancellor of various universities. Governors have responsibilities towards education. They're a part of the policy making setup as well. The Ministry of HRD, which now I believe will be called the Ministry of Education going forward, whichever name it is called, has primary responsibility for designing policies, which means they sit together, hopefully having gathered a lot of data and information from across the schools that they manage, and they aggregate that hopefully into information that tells them that this is the way forward. Now, ideally, the way policy should be designed is you say, here is a set of goals that's going to take the nation forward. Here is a set of goals that's going to be excellent for our students. Here is a set of goals that's going to bring quality into the conversation. Here is a set of goals that's going to bring our students, our teachers, our researchers, our professors onto the global stage. Here is how we raise the game. Those discussions are held. Those discussions are held, and those discussions are held amongst experts. And so these experts come together, some of them invited to committees, some who work independently. So for example, think tanks have a large role to play. Organizations such as yours and ours, and quite a few others, roundtables, have a role to play, because all of us bring our thinking into policy. And hopefully, as data gathering gets better and better, and we can always live in hope, we will have evidence to back up our beliefs as well. It's just not opinions, it's not just an aggregation of anecdotes, but we will have better and better ways to back up what we believe. All of that gets pulled together, and the government, once in a while, when they're persuaded enough.
And are these largely government people in these committees? These experts are people who are like in the positions of heads of institutions. Is there a private sector voice? Is there a civil society voice in the draft of the policy?
Normally, these are establishmentarians, in the sense these are experts who have caught the attention of the government because of certain work they have done or certain positions that they hold in universities, in different associations, even civil society associations. But what also happens simultaneously, and a role for the private sector and civil society, I do think there should be a stronger role for private sector and civil society, of course, but that's an opinion that I'm just bringing into the conversation. Your question was what actually happens. What happens is that people go in and give in their petitions to the government, and some civil servant is tasked with making big files out there and aggregating them. So yes, they participate in the conversation. Once a draft policy goes out, and this has been there since independence, whenever a draft policy is announced, feedback is sought. Now, till recently, and we have the internet and technology to thank for that, till recently, even the comments or the request for comments used to go out within specific circles. So your professors would get it, teacher associations would get it, teacher unions would get it. Wherever you have aggregates of influence in a way, they would get the request for feedback.
Got it.
Now, thankfully, with all the work that's been done in the past decade, and I will actually commend the work that was done when the policy drafting was initiated for this decade, where the then minister actually went down all the way to the Gram Panchayat level and had meetings, some of them virtual meetings, some of them real meetings, and actually went down to every teacher in every village, district, diet, etc., and asked them, what do you want policy to be? I did not expect much from that, but was deeply grateful that the conversation was extended.
Made it more real with the people.
Made it more real, also made it more challenging, because here's the big challenge. Policy speak and practice speak often don't match. So when you speak to a teacher about it, or somebody who's just lived in the village, for example, a village teacher, many of them, not all of them, many of them will simply be able to say, I do not have enough chalk. Now, again, this is the same bridge between policy and practice issue that pops up again, because the problem isn't that they don't have enough chalk. The policy guy needs to figure out that there's a supply chain issue. Who interprets the practitioner for the policymaker? Who interprets the policymaker for the practitioner remains an issue that remains unresolved in the policy sphere. There is a gap in this ecosystem, policy ecosystem, where the how needs to be demonstrated. But for example, if you say, one thing that we are seeing is teacher education is going to now be done as a 4-year B.Ed, though they're allowing a 1-year B.Ed in specific circumstances, etc., in multidisciplinary institutions. What does that actually mean? Does it mean that you're simply going to shift the B.Ed into a different building? Or does it actually mean that the teachers will go into different courses, will have the opportunity to do certain modules in different courses? Will they be doing units? Will they be getting certificates? What does it mean?
Meeta, how can we run small experiments to test the efficacy of certain ideas, thoughts, theories of change when there is so much pressure to do everything at scale? A typical IS officer, principal secretary does not want to engage in a conversation that is not about all 40,000 schools in his or her state.
That's a fantastic question, and actually a layered question, because you've built in so many parts to it. One, of course, remains the question of small pilots, because even if you go to a civil servant with an idea, you cannot go to them without proof of concept. So your conversation about scale can only happen after the proof of concept has happened. So there is no, you're not going to go to them and say, I shall do this at scale. Now the question remains, how do you, without their support or before approaching them for support, how do you start this proof of concept cycle? Well, you're going to need a lot of help, and you're going to need all the help that you can get from anybody and everybody. And that remains a huge challenge in India, because while CSR, that's something I've researched a little bit, while CSR tends to invest in education, we are still at the early stages of investment in education, where CSR will invest in infrastructure, CSR will invest in installing edutech in schools, but it is not going to invest as much in research. You will then have to depend upon philanthropy. We desperately need a very large number of foundations and trusts in India that have educational research at its core. And without that ecosystem in place, all of us are going to continue to struggle to bring good ideas to fruition. It is a little bit self-indulgent of all of us, mea culpa, completely. It is a bit self-indulgent to say, I want to do this because this has meaning for me. Only academics, actually, to be honest, have earned that, or have placed themselves in that ivory tower where they say, I will do what I please. The rest of us who also engage with certain activism, certain advocacy, it's our job to complete our job. And we haven't done that. We're mid-conversation, but thank you very much for that renewal of faith that just happened when I realized, gosh, there's so much more to be done here. There's a whole other piece that needs to be plugged in.
But what should we research on? I mean, isn't it just that we know everything in education, it's just a matter of execution? Is there anything pending to be researched?
Education is not a homogeneous sector. You're not building train wagons or widgets or anything like that. You're talking about people. People change and evolve all the time. So in that sense, our sector is fairly special. And it's special in that the questions may remain the same. If you look at the literature from the 17th century, 18th century, you'll find some amazing questions that have been answered so beautifully. You read a lot of John Dewey and you say, here are all the solutions to everything that we need. But then our questions are actually, firstly, they need to be much more granular. Our questions need to be more granular. Our questions need to test for time. Do they actually apply to our time? Do they actually apply to the ambitions and aspirations of who we are as a people? Do they apply to, please do not make me use the word future of work, but it is true, do they apply to who we want to be, to who our children will want to be, in defiance of all the good advice that we give them? So are we serving the defiance?
So can you give an example of a question that is granular, that is timeless, that is aspirational, and that is part of the future of work?
A very simple question, a very, very simple question could be, and this is something that somebody asked me recently, is that my child spends too much time on screens. How do I stop that from happening? Now that actually leads to a whole bunch of hypotheses. Firstly, at the 30,000 feet level, the question of is that the future of humankind? All the way down to, I mean, are children part of the same species, sapiens and so on and so forth? Or is this the next evolution in progress? We used to be taught to be very focused in our studies. Are these multi-focused? Are these multi-plane children in a way? Do they operate at different planes at the same time? So there are those big evolutionary questions to be asked within that. Then there are the tiny questions to be asked. What is the impact of so many hours of screen time on people's eyes? What does neuroscience have to say to the kind of, the quality of the content that is being delivered? Between these two, the big question and the tiny questions, there's so many other questions to study. So if you simply start with this one consumer demand oriented question, and this is why I say we need to listen more to be able to understand our questions. When we listen, we find our questions. And when we listen, we know that there is a whole universe that we need to evolve through our research. Because as education researchers, we are not just looking backwards at what worked well today and therefore will work tomorrow. What we're trying to do is we're trying to say, great, we know what worked well today, but what's going to build the future?
Well, I think that, there are multiple parameters, first of all, on different parts of well-being, like health, mental, learning. Now, within the realm of scholastic learning outcomes, obviously there has to be something where it's not just about the marks, but it's also about the quality of the questions that we're asking them. It has to be about getting some benchmarking information, whether it be in the classroom, in the city, in the country, and maybe in the nation. And thankfully, India signed up for PISA as well. So those are some of my thoughts.
No, I think you speak my mind in this. I think you did incredibly well in describing the issues that we have to hand. The question is, we tried that with CCE, did we not? With the CCE system, we tried to bring in social and emotional learning, we tried to bring well-being, we gave it marks. Right. And the stupidest thing that we did was to give it marks. Because the minute you give it that kind of a value, you have reduced the idea in any case. And that is one of the paradoxes in education that I'm writing about currently. But I completely accept the fact that we should have a wider angle lens to the outcomes of school. And again, we're still talking only school, we're not talking higher education yet, right. Because there again you need to be able to raise the game even better. Within school, you definitely need to bring in far more in terms of how we do things. The quality of the question is probably the central question in India's education sector today. How you design a question, what is the purpose of the question, the syntax of the question, and that leads directly to the PISA debacle of the past and optimism for the future. Everything impacts how we teach our students to think. But what you do is again change the nature of questions.
But it's hard.
Within the classroom, within examinations, and then at the second thing that you said, at the national level, which is what you said about a benchmark. I know that your firm has been doing excellent work across decades in creating certain benchmarks. And yet we have the disaster of the moderation in class 12 examinations because we do not have a standard spine, a statistical spine that can allow genuine moderation to happen across CBSE and state school boards. And we really, I mean, it's unfortunate that we have to depend upon a PISA to force us to create that benchmark, or we have to step up and possibly seek embarrassment. I mean, you said you're glad the PISA is coming in. I am so terrified. I am terrified that this is going to be another embarrassment for the nation. And that's okay, because again, failure is a path to the next success, yes. But there are times when you can learn before the failure as well, and the time to learn that is now. that we definitely need to have some sort of a benchmarking mechanism to calibrate our assessments.
But we struggle with that, Meeta. Like even with the work that we have done, to be able to, explain the importance of what goes behind making a good question. I mean, it seems so underrated to the receiver. Right? It's like, बड़ी बात क्या है, एक क्वेश्चन ही तो है, टेक्स्ट बुक में इतने सारे हैं, कोई भी ले लीजिए.
हाँ, और फिर ऊपर से क्वेश्चन बैंक पे एडुटेक बिजनेस बन रहे हैं.
हाँ.
Because question banks are business. So.
But presumably, if the question banks are of good quality questions and the preparation for that is of a way where your conceptual understanding is strengthened, I'm assuming that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah, for example, I love Chitra Ravi's work in Chennai. I don't know if you know her, and again, that's a business. But the nature of questions that they ask is really beautiful. The one that they like to showcase, I've heard it thrice, so thankfully I remember it, is something that they ask in class 3 or 5. What would a conversation between the square and between the area and a perimeter of a square be? So the area and the perimeter become two persona, and one is talking to the other, saying, I just have to walk in a straight line. And can you imagine the visualization that's happening over there? And the other one is like, I'm spread all over the place, and I just can meet you at the edges. And suddenly the child actually knows the concept, has lived that concept. Now you see, somebody who's grown up without these questions will obviously look at question banks. They've lived 50 years. They're sitting in a chair of power in front of you. The non-visualization approach has worked well for them. So why would they see the need for a different approach, right?
Right.
The old approach has worked for them. Now it comes back to the same question. Who is responsible for helping them see better?
Right.
And if we call ourselves educators, sometimes educators are called teachers. Who will teach them how to visualize this better?
So both of us have to go and do a lot of work instead of just talking to each other right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because this is going to be blood and tears, sweat, blood and tears. Honestly, this is not easy. This is not easy at all. How do I go and tell this guy? Firstly, of course, you've got to peel away the ego. Then you've got to peel away the history. You've got to peel away the position as well from the conversation over there. Then you've got to peel out the previous success, because they have evidence and we don't, right? They have 50 years of evidence saying this worked well.
Right.
Not only that, they have 50 years of evidence from across the world that says whenever people move to more liberal regimes and questions, those economies have wobbled. Look at the example of the UK,
Right.
where they seem to be going back to a more traditionalist approach. And look, I mean, there are enough examples across the world. What else do you need to peel? Then you need to show them how this new questioning structure is going to work. And how, and for me, for example, what is success in this is when I give a question to a child or a group of children, then I see their eyes light up with animation. I see great conversations. How do I measure as a success? How do I measure that? I mean, of course, we can measure pupil dilation. Maybe we should start doing that, saying how excited were the children to get to that, and how quickly did they get to a solution. Maybe we need to invent new ways of showcasing success and saying this works.
India is participating in PISA 2021. Do you think that we should just adopt that as a national exam?
Adopting something like that will take a lot more persuasion than simply conversations between you and I. If it's not something that we can reach out for and actually implement, I'm not going to play that. Is there good in PISA? Yes, of course. We get a sense of where we are in the world, because the whole point of schooling is to prepare our children for the world of citizenship and the world of work. So yes, there is good in PISA. Should we be doing this each time it is offered? Yes, absolutely. Should we be adopting it as a national benchmark? In principle, no, because a global study cannot be a national benchmark. And that national requirements will require a national benchmark. And international requirements require an international test.
Is there any downside in preparing for PISA?
I don't see any downside in over preparing for anything. I grew up in the Indian education system. I am Magoo Max over here. Honestly, the more we prepare, the more we over prepare to be ready for whatever the world brings on, the better off we are. So I see absolutely no downside in preparing for PISA. I would like to add that preparing for PISA doesn't simply mean training up a few sets of students, however randomly they are selected. It doesn't mean training them up in a specific exam system. It means understanding what, in fact, treating it as a project, saying here is a set of goals and understanding this is the requirement of your client or your project. If you want to play to win, if you want to play to learn, that's different. And that's the third part of this conversation. If you want to win at the PISA, then be very focused on saying this is what the exam is going to do, this is what learning means for that exam. The exam question paper might change at the last minute, people understand that. Every question taker in this country, we've all done exams, testing exams, we understand that. It can change, therefore understand the principles on which it is based, and then work your way towards it. And working will involve training as well, but it will involve a lot more besides. It will involve learning for beyond measurement. It will mean that you will be learning for mastery. It will mean that you're learning for meaning. And without meaning, I mean, how can you even, what are you doing here? What are you doing in this world of learning? So I think preparing for PISA hopefully will have this upside of leading us to the land of meaning.
Meeta, if we were to prepare for PISA 2030, 10 years from now, what are the top 3 things India should do?
So the 3 things that we should do will remain absolutely the same. One is learning for meaning. Second is learning to deliver to multiple goals. And multiple goals will mean that we will not only be focused on what we call academic, but we will also be focused on delivering the answer in many different ways. What does that mean? That means that our tests, our questions, our exams, the nature of both learning and assessment will be about creating collaborative exercises, will be about creating critical thinking exercises, creative exercises, communication. We've done 4 of the 5 C's already, haven't we? Now, they're not 21st century skills in my opinion, they are eternal skills. But we have not been able to incorporate them into our assessment system and therefore learning system yet. So we are definitely being challenged to do that now. That's certainly a part of our job. Are we talking about social and emotional learning within this? Of course we are. Are we talking about leadership qualities within this? Absolutely we are. Another thing that I'm working on personally and hopefully should have a framework out in about 2 or 3 months is a set of pivotal skills. Should we be talking about these pivotal skills? Absolutely yes. Maybe that's what we should be designing for. And the third thing that we should be doing, because you asked for 3, is take a deep and hard look at how we teach and learn. And unfortunately, so much has happened. We've moved the needle, so we're in a better place than we were 10 years ago, definitely in a better place. But what we have not worked on yet is the power play in education. And we just need to get rid of all of that drama. And whether you're talking about power play in, I'm not going to call it power play in policy making, maybe there isn't, maybe there isn't, but in the classroom, there clearly is this power play that is happening where the teacher thinks that they are in a position of power and the student thinks that they have been disempowered. And therefore, there is a whole power drama that is happening. That dynamic has to go. Until that dynamic happens, we will not have that. I mean, my definition of learning is a flow of energy. When I'm absolutely energized by that content, I feel that content, I live that content for that minute, that teacher, what do you call inspiration? That's energy. That makes me want to go home and say, I want to know more about this. A child who comes home and says, I learnt about friction today. and chatters about it to every possible uncle, auntie, or dog or cat they find, is an excited learning child. Yes. I want to see that enjoyment. That you're not going to have that with some power play drama happening.
What opportunities do public-private partnerships, or PPP as they're called, provide in education?
Now, PPP is actually surprisingly fairly controversial, because from where I come, it seems to be such a logical solution. Have the government support something, have a specialist in place, have somebody, some do-gooder or foundation, somebody with purpose, fund it, and you create some sort of vehicle and a structure where you can test new ideas so that you know whether they work or they don't before you unleash it upon the public.
Right.
PPP is just such a logical part of the Indian way of doing things as well. I don't know if you've ever been into a public sector bank, and where one officer says, "Sir, आप file लेके उनके पास जाइए, वहाँ पे signature करवा लीजिए." And that person does their work, and then you take the file and go from office to office, right?
Right.
Now, in the NHS, the UK system, where the medical system, you don't have sight of your files or your records. But here in a bank or in a hospital, you're the one doing half the work, right? Who are you? You are Mr. Private. Who is that institution? That's Mr. Mrs. whatever public, right?
Right.
So is that a partnership in place? Is that a working, effective, efficient partnership that delivers with efficacy on time? Yes. So are we overcomplicating the question? Maybe we are, because we are trying to set public-private partnership systems in place. Whereas public-private partnership practices are already in place. What do you call a WhatsApp group with government school teachers, their students and their parents already in that WhatsApp group? Is that not a public-private partnership in action?
It is.
It is. So we are already there. We're actually already doing well. It's just that in creating the structures around it and formalizing it, we're having some trouble along the way. We'll work it out. I think it's a great way forward because it involves everybody. It's inclusive. It builds access. It builds quality.
So PPP for experimentation of new ideas, of new ways of doing things seems like a nice fit, because you have philanthropic donors, venture philanthropy that is willing to experiment with new ideas, willing to fund the research output and the documentation that comes out of that. But a lot of the anti-PPP sentiment is essentially around, should private sector be in control of education? Should, the private sector...
Power drama again, right? Control, go on.
Yeah, and the private sector perhaps, asking a lot of the current staff members, government school teachers, to potentially asking them to leave, right? I think a lot of the negative sentiment is coming more because of these job security and the unions that might feel threat, right?
Well, then that's a design question, right? If one has recognized that as a problem, then one needs to design to mitigate these fears. What's also important, there's another fear that you haven't articulated, and that is the philanthropist will want to impose their point of view on the outcomes of the study. And has that been known to happen? Possibly in the medical sciences it has been known to happen, that studies have been manipulated. Does that mean that people of integrity, and I am including present company here, people of integrity do not seek private funding? Of course not. You need the funding to be able to do that documentation, to be able to manage the travel to the interiors. Who's going to do that? If an independent body does not do that, the independent body also has to buy tickets,
right,
and needs a pillow to sleep on at night or whatever. You need to fund something like that. So what we need then, what do we need in place then? Do we need transparency? Do we need better governance structures? Do we need sight of what the philanthropist is saying, that this is my point of view and therefore I'm funding that, and hopefully have another philanthropist who is available over there? Whatever it is, we need to be able to fix this trust deficit as well within PPPs.
And has this been done anywhere globally?
Well, there was this very interesting discussion that I was a part of, I think 2 or 3 years ago. To be honest, I don't know how that exercise progressed eventually, where we got in a few ministers of education from across the globe in the room and got in a few researchers into the room. and a couple of activists. I have no idea why I was invited there, but I was really glad to be in the room over there. And we asked the ministers, what is it going to take to have you support PPPs? Because here are the reasons why we think it's a good idea. And they basically said, if you can show us a roadmap. Now it again comes back to us, right? That we need to work harder at pushing what we do. So if you can show us a roadmap that mitigates the risks of PPP, including, they're political beasts, the ministers, even though they're retired by then and therefore they could speak their mind freely. They said, if you can show us a roadmap, and sometimes that's called an action plan in India, and if you can show us how it will work out, then we would be able to engage with you better. So what we then need is a roadmap to effective PPP. And that's a piece of work that's sitting out there waiting for people to do. Who will fund that? Maybe another PPP exercise.
Meeta, I got the advice of picking one sector, picking a theme, and going very deep in it. And I was very fortunate that educational initiatives allowed me to do that in assessments and in personalized learning. Did you not get that advice? It seems like you've gone all over the place over the last 20 years.
This is what other people say, that I've gone all over the place. But in my mind's eye, I have been very, very focused on understanding the whole of the education sector and how its various segments engage with each other. Education financing and funding cannot be separated from what actually happens in the classroom. Curriculum design cannot be separated from what that student has to memorize when they open their notebook. Policy design cannot be separated from what the teacher receives as a letter from their teachers' union. None of these is separate. When I introduce myself as somebody who works in education, the first question I'm asked is, oh, K-12 or higher education? And I honestly find that very, very silly, I'm sorry to say, because that is just a budgeting divide that was created by some administrator some 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Just because there's a K-12 budget and somebody looks after it and there is a higher education budget does not mean that the lessons of running a tutorial for PhD students cannot be transferred to running a Montessori classroom, right, and vice versa. In fact, if you look at the learnings of a Montessori classroom and you look at the kind of tutorials the professors run on their open door days or hours in office, the toolkits are very similar. So if we restrict ourselves to verticals, we are restricting our ability to learn from within the sector. And if we are learning professionals, why would we be restricting learning? That never made sense to me. So this is why I've engaged as a manager, I've engaged as a teacher, I've engaged as a learner, obviously. I've engaged with the rich and the elite, the ones who learn super fast. I've engaged at the community college level, where I walk into the classroom and it's full of people on day release from jail and refugees, some of whom have a PhD that's not acknowledged in this country and others who are barely literate. So I've engaged with the private sector at the elite level, in schools. I've worked a bit with budget private schools or the affordable private schools as well, because if we are not able to exchange learning from one to the other, then how are we in the business of doing what we say we do?
And you do this exchange of learning very well on Twitter. Why do you tweet so much?
Lovely. Why do I tweet so much? Everything that we do with a passion starts with a little bit of annoyance and anger always. And one thing that bothered me always was almost the monopolization of the education conversation amongst those of us who were fortunate enough to be called the elite. We are well educated, we are articulate, we have had the resources to be able to engage in a sector that gives very low returns at the very beginning. That luxury is not available to all. Some of us we do it because we care about it. It's a vocation. So this is something that is that annoyed me. Saying the other thing that annoyed me was the fact that we only had supply side conversations. I'm a trained MBA. One of the things they teach us is marketing. I mean, they laugh at us saying that we are trained to sell soap. Well, when you sell soap, the first thing you do is you figure out the demand, what's the pain point, what is the need out there. How can we not do that in education? So I wanted to hear the voice of the people. The democratization of the education conversation was what took me to Twitter. And what I tried to do over there was actually organize it into something that would sound very 21st century. So what I was trying to create out there, and I've done it now for 6 years, I'm just tapering off now because I think that experiment is fairly complete, is I started something called #EduIn. And this was a monthly conversation on education topics. And I swear I was terrified I would be trolled. Not once in 6 years have we been trolled. We've had experts on this. We've had lay people on this. We've had young teachers as part of the conversation. We've had technology individuals come in. We've had parents. We've had people who never want to be parents but have a strong opinion on how their education should have been better. And education engenders very strong opinions. None of them were expressed in a strong voice. We had beautiful dialogues. I think at its peak, our reach, which is a slightly technical term, the reach was up to, I think, 15 million.
Wow, congrats.
Yes, thank you. It was absolutely fantastic. And I think from my point of view, the bit that's not visible, is I was building this virtual grid or a virtual think tank of education opinion.
Great, Meeta. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed learning a lot more about PPP, about education policy, how it's made, how it's impacting learning outcomes, and the interesting conversation around learning outcomes, the different boards we have, and what should be the quality of the question that is asked within that. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes.